I think it's a huge pleasure to have Avi Parser speaking to us today. Avi is one of those people in the industry that have his fingers pretty much on everything that we technologically wise use today. So he is in the XR Metaverse industry for over 30 years. He worked with Disney on VR experiences back in the 90s. He crafted 3D worlds in Second Life. He founded a company called Keyhole, which then became the foundation for Google Earth at Google. He helped Microsoft, or he co-invented the HoloLens at Microsoft, and worked with Amazon and on AR audio interfaces. He worked at Apple on some. Lately, he's focusing on ethics, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it is a huge pleasure to have you here in the class and show your perspective. So Avi, take it away. Thank you for being with us.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, I've had the opportunity to work on some really fun projects going all the way back, like I said, Disney back in the 90s and Keyhole, and got to consult on Second Life and built a lot of the 3D object system there, and HoloLens we started in 2010 and Echo Frames in 2015. And I can't talk about Apple, but I can talk about the process. I can't talk about any products or any rumors. My default answer is I can neither confirm nor deny, blah, blah, blah. But I can talk about the process. And I think this is relevant for, especially for the Media Lab, because it turns out over the years, I've hired a lot of people from the Media Lab to work on my teams, on my prototyping team. So Media Lab folks make great prototypers, but there are some differences. And I wanted to kind of point that out. These are things that I've learned over the years. And so, I like to call them free range programmers, because we kind of let them wild and see what they come up with. We try not to be too prescriptive about what people are doing. But there is a process, and it's a process we have to stick to when we do experience prototyping. What we're trying to do is to prototype the future, prototype experiences that customers in the future will love. But we're trying to learn from those, and we're trying to gain some confidence from those. So experience prototyping ultimately is about trying to do the most efficient exploration of the solution space for a given future product, something that might not exist today. We have to answer the key questions, but it has to be aligned to the organization's priorities. And so I think the main difference, I'd say, from what you might do in academia is that it may be less about trying to be original and to add to the field, and more about building confidence among designers and executives and people who are making decisions, because some of these decisions are billion-dollar decisions. And so it's worth spending $1 million or two to prototype these things ahead of time to try to get an idea of whether the $1 billion is going to be well spent or not. I think that's really the difference between a successful product and a not successful product, is trying these things out early, making sure that we're confident that we're on the right track. And if we're not confident, go back and try again. Keep at it, keep prototyping until we have something that we feel is magical, that people are going to love. And then you pour the money into it. So obviously I can't say anything about unannounced products, but that's the process by which we've come up with a lot of these products over the years. And it really does work well, because we get as close to the final idea as we can without having to spend all that money and all that time and all that risk. So where are we now? Just a casual observation of LinkedIn. By the way, I want to thank Elon Musk for getting me off Twitter. I finally broke that habit. But I do spend a lot of time on LinkedIn now, unfortunately. And Tom Fisk had this really great infographic showing the famous Homer meme. All the Metaverse experts kind of disappeared, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of AI experts that popped up. But leave it to Professor Bob Stone to kind of take it to the next level. And what we're really looking at is, there are a bunch of XR experts that showed up, and they became Metaverse experts, and then they became AI experts. And it's a bit frustrating, I think, for those of us who've been in the field for a long time to see these people kind of come and get a lot of attention. But it does tend to go away pretty quickly. What is going on with that? Well, if you remember back a couple of years ago, the company formerly known as Facebook did this thing that we like to use this term in Microsoft called licking the cookie. This is how I can best describe the behavior that I saw, which is, there's a plate of cookies and they look pretty good, but you want them. And so you lick as many as you can and put them back on the plate so no one else will eat them. Licking the cookie has another connotation of sort of desperation, as in Squid Game, where you really want to lick them as fast as you can because you're worried that someone else is going to come in and steal your cookies. And so I don't think it was healthy. I think we're seeing the ramifications of it now with, fortunately, a lot of layoffs. When you build too fast and you realize that you're maybe not building quite the right thing, then it's going to result in some unfortunate things happening. And I think the one thing to take away from that is this old phrase that I learned, and I would encourage everybody to memorize, is under promise and over deliver. You don't want to do the opposite. You don't want to over promise and under deliver. That's a great way to upset your customers. But you want to be really kind of careful about what you promise and make sure people aren't disappointed. By the way, you see the QR code at the top in various slides, and I hope I made these big enough to survive the compression or whatever this winds up as. If not, let me know, I'll send you the links. But I tried to put links to other materials that are related. So that particular link goes to where this slide came from, which was a talk I gave at AWE 2 years ago, where I first showed this and a couple of other funny segments that I don't have time to show today. So if you're interested, go look at that. So here's what I think is going on. And I did a casual graph of the hype over the years, remembering when were the peaks and the valleys and all these different terms. I'm old enough to remember when cyberspace was huge. That was the next big thing, and it went away. And today you only really hear cyber in the context of security, military even security, and warfare. But nobody really uses it to describe the metaverse anymore, because now we say the metaverse. And so the question is the metaverse the ultimate term? And I have a feeling it isn't. I've been around long enough that it wasn't the first term that I used, so it's not the one that I'm most fond of. But everybody else seems to like it, and as long as it's well understood, I'm okay with it. But I do actually think it's going to die down a bit. We've seen it die down already this year. AI, the orange wave, has come in and taken over this year. But I have a feeling that there'll be a new term, probably based on whatever product is the most successful, in the same way that we used Google for search as a kind of placeholder for that idea. I have a feeling there'll be a new name that we all use. I don't know what it is. I could guess, and I have proposals, but nobody listens to me anyway. So better to just leave it open for now. But the point of this slide is that these hype cycles come and go. We can't get too enamored of them, because there'll be a new one along in a year or two. They're not the healthiest thing in the world. They really do get some people rich quick and other people get burned, but it is the way things have been working recently. And it reminds me a lot of South Park underpants gnomes. If you don't remember that, they were these gnomes that would go steal underpants, and then their plan was to profit, but they didn't really know what phase 2 was. That I think that's what a lot of what's going on is you have a lot of people who can see the potential, and they kind of can see the end game, but they don't know how to get there. And so they hype things up before they're ready, because they really don't know what's going to take 5 years, what's going to take 10 years. And in general, best not to listen to the gnomes. But even the people we like and respect when they predict the future can be wrong. I mean, these are a bunch of books that I love that are mostly wrong about the future, even including Snow Crash and the Metaverse. I think Neil Stephenson got a lot of the aspects wrong. In fact, we certainly don't want to recreate the world of Snow Crash. It's a very dystopian world, even if he got a few of the other things right. In fact, out of this whole list, I'd actually give the most points to Octavia Butler for getting future society really well nailed in terms of the sort of endless crises that we're going through. She really did nail that. If you haven't read those books, I'd recommend it. I also put together this little chart. Hopefully compression's not killing it, but went back and tried to find the earliest instance of various words to see when they really were introduced, partly to make sure the right people got credit for that, and partly just to show how many words there really are. And even when I put this out on the internet, I got a bunch of people saying back, there's more words that I'm not including. So I tried not to include the ones that people are pushing, that are marketing terms, but the ones that really stuck and became popular over time. But you can see how far back a lot of these terms go. Even the term virtual reality can be traced all the way back to 1938, and spectacles 1935 in terms of magic glasses that could do things. And you'll see some of the other terms for the metaverse, like the other plane and cyberspace you probably heard of. The metaverse itself has had at least 3 different major revisions of its definition, starting first as a mostly virtual world. Nobody wanted to do AR in Snow Crash because the real world kind of sucked. Although you could, technically, nobody did it. There was a Metaverse roadmap in 2006 or so that had a bunch of definitions for it. And now there's new ones that include Web3 and crypto and a bunch of stuff. So, that one keeps changing. And we see, John Hanke of Niantic put out his variation on it in 2021, which was the real world metaverse, which I like a little more. But, these terms come and go. There'll be more. So let me try to provide a little bit of a framework for understanding, especially understanding the effects of this stuff on people. And this I hope is not new to anybody, but I want to just make sure it's visible, because we often forget about it, especially when we call this stuff the metaverse. I think that hides a lot of what's going on. The term virtual worlds, I think, is a much better term for many of these things, because this happens in normal communication. When we are talking to each other, I may say car, talking to you, and I have one imagination of what a car is. That exists in the virtual world in my mind, in a psychological sense. And you have another virtual world. You hear the word car. And communication is really the act of synchronizing these virtual worlds using language, using writing or speech. And that's existed as long as there's been language. And probably even before, I would imagine. And with computer-mediated versions of these things, it's essentially the same. It's just a little more complicated. I explain my world to the computer through tools that I might use. The computer has a model that is representing a copy of the world, and someone else can experience that copy of the world. And so we're using the computer to mediate the communication between us in a way that is hopefully better than what we would do face-to-face with just saying the word car. In other words, I might say the word car, the computer could actually conjure a car, to be super literal about it. And then you're going to have a much closer idea to what I meant by car when the computer shows you what it thinks my idea is, and hopefully it guesses right. And a lot of the stuff that's going on with generative AI, I think, moves us along the lines of trying to make sure this is a reality where the whole goal of XR is really to improve communication between people. But overall, it's got a lot of potentials. This is from a talk that I gave in 2013, and the thesis of the talk is that every game-changing technology can be seen as a human superpower. So what does that mean? How do you figure this out? Well, the process is pretty simple. So take the technology, describe it like a superpower, find the intrinsic human need, and then we're going to project it forward into new tech like XR tech. So what I did as an exercise was try to find examples that existed before XR of all these kinds of superpowers. And so you could say the telephone is a form of very primitive telepathy. Obviously, we're not reading each other's minds, but it is bridging distance. It is communication over distance. And that's sort of an early step on the way to telepathy. And television is a form of clairvoyance, and the wheel is a form of telekinesis, if you think about it. It's a form of being able to move heavy things from one place to another that's easier than carrying them. It's not the Jedi mind power that we would really imagine as telekinesis, but these are all primitive forms of that on the way. And this gives you an idea of how to build a table of what those superpowers might be for XR. And that's what we're going to do next. But there's some caveats. I did that in 2013 and then started thinking about it a lot more and had some great conversations with Keiichi Matsuda about this. And also started realizing, well, so there's some downsides to superpowers, not just the fact that everyone has the kryptonite, but there's some downsides to consider. One is that we have deeply personal ideas of what super is. So it's not all the same for everybody. We also want to be really careful because some people are trying to overcome their natural limits. Like my older son is autistic, and so a superpower for him might be just speaking. Honestly, he uses an iPad to communicate, and so what we might consider normal for him might be a superpower. But there are other people who want to seek power over other people, and that's not necessarily what I would advocate for superpowers. When the powers are distributed unequally, they can create anxiety, anger, instability, and blowback. We'll see an example of that in a second. And the other side of it is when superpowers become common, we may take them for granted, like speech in our case. If we don't have any issues with speaking, then we don't really consider it super, but it might be for someone who doesn't speak to begin with. And they really should benefit everyone equitably. I think that's the bottom line here is you never want to introduce a new superpower that only helps a few people. It doesn't have to help everyone the same way, but it should be equitable. So here's that example of where superpowers went wrong. We gave some people the superpowers with glass to be able to see things that we couldn't see and take pictures of us without our consent. Even though you can already do that on a cell phone camera, putting it in your face made it that much more obnoxious. And there was a lot of blowback and really a big problem with the way they marketed this. And it's not that it killed it ultimately, but it really set it back a number of years. What would have happened instead if they had emphasized privacy as a superpower of these glasses? If they had said, we're going to automatically blur the background so that you only see the people who have consented to be in your shot. We can remove people. We have the technology to blur or remove people who have not given consent. So we are effectively changing the equation to be pro-privacy and pro-everybody instead of trying to superpower the wearer. That's an example of something they could have done. And if you want to broaden that out and generalize it, then there's a spectrum of superpower results from all the way from socially destructive to socially constructive. And what we'll do next is take a look at some of the most common superpowers that we talk about for XR and see where they fall on that spectrum. So remember the color coding from red to green. So here we have an example of flying. That's a pretty good one. It doesn't really hurt anybody to enable people to fly. Having some form of teleportation through portals, also pretty safe. Portals can be used to abuse people. They could be used like web bugs. If you create an invisible portal into someone's space, you could maybe figure out a way to track them, but mostly it's good. Hand tracking, telekinesis, that's a pretty powerful one as long as you're not throwing things at people and hurting them. Super strength, again, it gets sort of borderline. If I have super strength, then I might hurt you inadvertently if we're in a virtual world that allows that. Invisibility seems like a good one, except it could be used for spying. So that's a little bit, on the dangerous end of the spectrum. It could be used for self-protection. And here I'm just, talking about harassment in general. It's one of these things where we're exerting force against people, against their will. That's definitely on the red end of that spectrum. For the AR side of the spectrum, telepathy is one of those, telepresence. This is me back when I had more hair and less white. Doing some experiments with reprojected video using depth and color. This is back at Microsoft. There's some good examples out there of being able to manipulate time in AR, so you can see historical versions of things, where you are in the world. Here's another child who's autistic who's using glass to be able to see the emotions of other people. So he's seeing icons that represent the computer's understanding of the faces of other people, and that's helping him to understand their emotions. So that's a pretty positive thing in general. Here's some X-ray vision. We consider that pretty positive. It gets a little iffy. We talk about the military again. Here's night vision, being able to superimpose people on top of things. And then at the red end of the spectrum, I'd put mind control, ad tech. If you're interested, I just did a talk at Stanford on the implications of eye tracking and ad technology together. It's an 18-minute talk, and there's a link there, and that video is from it. So I'll just leave it at that, but I encourage you to go watch that talk. So here's a good example of a visualization of holographic telepresence, of what it probably should look like. People should feel like they're in the same room together and be able to have joint attention and see where each other's gaze are. And, they always get the actual design review a bit wrong because it's usually more involved than that. It's not just changing the colors of seats. And of course, you have to wonder why this guy's even wearing a hard hat to use XR. That's sort of extra, not really necessary. The glasses would be, but it's a good depiction of it. We've seen other examples that don't even require glasses, where we have augmented reality out in the world. That's another really cool superpower and something we would expect to see more of. I love this clip from one of the Batman movies of being able to use the cell phones to create a spatial visualization of where all the bad guys are. And of course, no one's giving their consent for this, so this has some issues. But if we don't take it literally, it probably won't technically be possible. It's a really cool idea of collective intelligence where we could all contribute willingly. And you can see it a little more concretely in these examples of using Find My Friends or using maps like Waze or Google Maps or Apple Maps. There's telemetry in both ways. So we get to learn where the traffic is because everybody's phone is sending telemetry, and we can share that perceptual intelligence with everybody else so they know which roads not to go on. Of course, it's not perfect. You can put a couple hundred cell phones in a cart and screw the whole algorithm because it thinks there's traffic where there isn't, but it's pretty good. There's this thing we used to call the AR cloud that kind of got subsumed into the metaverse, and various examples of it. Personally, I like calling this the World Wide World. It seems to make much more sense to me because it's analogous to the World Wide Web. It's the web, but overlaid on reality. You can call it the spatial web too, if you like. But some examples we've seen. The lower left one is some work I did at Microsoft again on something we called Read Write World, which was trying to make a collaborative version of that we could all edit and work together. There's another sort of pet project of mine I'm really interested in is this idea of using eye tracking and other biometrics to be able to make a magic pair of glasses that isn't even about visualizing the world, but It's about giving ourselves emotional intelligence. And so I don't know if you've all had that experience, but I have, of when you get upset about something, you're not necessarily going to say all the right things. You may say something you might regret later when you're in a heightened state of anxiety or nervousness or anger. So what if we had the kind of biofeedback that could give us the sense of how we feel, so we know we're in those states, and we have some warning to not say something that we don't want to say. You could also take this even further and imagine colorizing the lenses. So if it knows that we're depressed today, maybe it enhances the brightness of the world in order to try to make us feel better. That all goes towards increasing the emotional intelligence and our interactions with the world. And the last one I'll leave you with in this section is this idea of, if we did have this biometric sensing and we can solve the privacy issues, there's something that I've sort of noticed over the years, is that we're pretty good about, when there are major disasters in the world, we might donate to charities that will help, whether there's been fires or floods, but we're not as good helping locally. We're not as good helping people on the street. And I don't give money to people on the street, mostly because I don't want to encourage it, but I also feel badly about that. And I feel like I want to help, I just don't know how. So maybe there's a way that we can use everybody's collective intelligence to build up a map of where we need help, where we need attention, where people are hurting, where there's places, even when there's places that people are happy, it might be interesting to go and join the party when people are actually having a good time. But we may be able to build up these maps if we can figure out how to do it in a way that doesn't hurt people. I think it'd be a pretty positive result of XR to bring us closer together. All right, so now moving on into the future. When we talk about how is the metaverse going to evolve, I always want to remind people of how the web evolved, because I think it's probably going to be pretty similar. The web did not have a map. There's a lot of people who want to build a map of the metaverse. I don't think you really can. So try if you want to, but the web started with a single web page. It linked, another web page was created and it linked back to the first one, and keep repeating the process until you wind up with a web of pages that all link to each other, and eventually add multimedia and other pages and books, and eventually you can build a site like Facebook that indexes things, and Google that indexes search, and has its own private copies of things. But it starts and it grows very organically, and I don't really think, partly because it's more than three-dimensional, it's n-dimensional, but partly just because it's organic. I don't really think you could build a map. And so the metaverse, even though some people like to visualize it as universe, galaxies, solar system, planet, in some sort of really logical organization, I really don't think it'll start that way. I think it'll start off as a couple of spaces that are separate, that get connected, and people decide to build links and portals between those spaces, and you wind up with just another web through the idea of portals. And that would eventually include multimedia books just the same, and search engines and all that, but with a twist. We'll get to the twist a little bit. It'll be a little different, but more or less similar. What we don't want is for interoperability to be as bad as it's been these last few years. You really want to be able to mix and match content, combine things, and not just take screenshots of the various spaces. And that's not interoperability. That's a failure case. So we're looking for something that's more like portals. So here's a little simple video of walking through a portal that I didn't make. But if you want to make these analogies to the web, then crossing links is kind of like teleporting from one page to another. But you could also embed references. One web page could include content from another web page, and an iframe on the web could theoretically include an entire web page within it. These have analogies in virtual worlds to linked worlds, composite worlds, and portals. A portal is very much like an iframe. It should be a secure boundary. You shouldn't really leak anything but a preview of what that space is going to look like across it, because there's all sorts of exploits you can imagine if you can make portals do more than that. All right, one question people ask me all the time, and I do a lot of calls with investors and companies, and they want to know, when is going to be the iPhone moment for XR? There's some point where it's not XR, and there's some point where it's XR, and it turns out that never happens. This is not how reality works. If you want to look at the actual iPhone moment, it wasn't a moment. It was a progression over almost 10 years. When the first iPhone came out, some people were super excited about it. A lot of people still had their BlackBerries and were like, no, I like my keyboard, my physical keyboard. I'm not ready to switch over. But people had to try it. They had to gain a level of confidence. And it wasn't even when the App Store came out. Some people say, well, that was the critical moment. Now, the App Store wasn't there initially. It came out later. But it was really where we reached a sort of confidence point. It is the tipping point where it isn't when the sales hit a certain number. That's not really what happens. It's really about when there's a cross section of the critical mass, enough people have it and they're confident. And then the people who don't have it can see the people who have it, but they're happy with it. And they go, okay, maybe I'll be happy with it too. So it's a confidence interval that people really want to find to be able to jump on the tech. And there's always going to be people that are early adopters that jump on early, and there's always going to be people who are at the latter end of the curve. And maybe it hits a mathematical inflection point, somewhere around that same point. But it's flexible. It doesn't have to happen there. So if you ask me, I'd say, give or take 3 years, 2025, and we're already a year into that cycle. And so clearly hasn't quite happened yet. And this ultimately really depends on consumer confidence and people feeling like it's going to be good for them. And given the quality of a lot of the headsets, I'd say we're definitely not there yet. I might even push this out a little bit further. All right. So one other thing that happens with the metaverse is that people who made some of the definitions of the metaverse did something that kind of annoyed me, and I pushed back on it. They said the metaverse is the sum of all virtual worlds, including AR. And I was like, whoa. This is a little bit of a problem here. We got to take a step back, because what we don't want is for everything in the universe to be in a globally shared address space. You might think you want that, but I don't think we do, because if you do that, we wind up with things like Zoom bombing, where you might be having a private conversation, and if that conversation has an address and somebody else can jump in, that's a problem. We don't necessarily want that. And even in the case of having a meeting like this, we might have decided in the future to put this meeting on the top of the Eiffel Tower, but that's not the Eiffel Tower. That's our copy of the Eiffel Tower, because what we wouldn't want is for random people to be coming in and out of our meeting and disrupting things. If anything, we'd want to have the actual participants, like who's actually in this meeting, plus a bunch of NPCs to make it look like there's more people, but those NPCs are not spying on us. They're just window dressing. So there's a lot of cases where we really don't want everything linked together, and it usually revolves around privacy. So just a real quick note on the whole AR VR spectrum. It's going away because the devices are going to be hybrid. Most of the devices coming out that have been announced are mixed between AR and VR. You could move back and forth on the spectrum. You can imagine the slider that lets you move back and forth. So you don't have to be one or the other anymore. But the key difference that's always going to be the case, I believe, is that AR is about being more present here in our own lives, and VR is really about being present somewhere else. That goes to what kind of use cases each one of those has, as opposed to the technology. The technology will wind up converging eventually. And there's another difference with AR versus VR, is that you have many different coordinate systems. AR does come in a geolocated coordinate system, but it doesn't have to. You can have AR that's local to the room that you're in, or to some physical object like a QR code or a can of Coke. It could be referenced to your body, as you've seen a lot of the snap filters. It could be something that maps to your face, and it works anywhere as long as you have a face. And of course, it could also be in a heads-up display. In that case, it's relative to where you're looking in your glasses. It's not in the world. It's more like in your own personal space. So that's something I think that sets AR and VR apart. But it's more to do with the use cases of AR. One of those important qualities is that AR should always be additive, but adding too much is subtractive. Here's an example. If these had been virtual worlds, let's say these were 7 virtual worlds, I could just jump between them. I could get in my little spaceship and jump between these worlds. But if there's 7 versions of the real world, and you overlaid them, you're going to get a mess. This is not good. We don't want to just see all content overlaid on geospatial coordinates all the time. It's going to be worse than Keiichi Matsuda's hyperreality video, and hopefully you've all seen that. Here's a frame from that video. It's already a mess, and he did this intentionally, but it's already a mess. If we were to overlay another reality on top of that, things become really hard to understand. And let's put even a third one. Forget it. We're not going to be able to live in a world where everything shows up all the time. We're going to need filters. We're going to need ways of saying, here's what I'm doing right now, and here's my intent, and only show me the stuff that I need to see, because the world is noisy enough. If anything, AR should maybe help us filter the real world as well. Sometimes that's called diminished reality, but I think it's a way of filtering to enhance our focus. There's nothing diminished about it. The things I think we're going to need are things that I like to call contextual discovery engine. The engine knows what our intent is, and it knows a lot about us, and so it can help us find things out in the world so that we're not overwhelmed. I think we're also going to need something that I would today call a personal AI shield, which is, again, that contextually relevant AI that knows us so well that it can actually prevent us from falling into traps and scams out in the world. And I do think one of the most important aspects of AR is going to be the holographic telepresence that I know a lot of you and I'm certainly interested in and want to move forward. And there's still a lot of challenges there, but it's going to be super important. We want to be able to make connections with other people and talk to the people when we want to talk to. So how is that all going to come together? Well, in one sense, we can imagine the glasses as a filter. They filter the world to the red stuff, which is maybe skating stuff, the green stuff, which is maybe nature stuff. And this introduces a dichotomy between what you might call verses and purses, where verses are about the versional things in the world that may change. There might be multiple copies of them. And purses are the personal things. Should be easy to remember. Verses is versional, purses is personal. And we keep them separate, and the glasses essentially become the firewall that are the interface between those two realities. So how do you know which is which? Well, if it's just for you, it's probably not the metaverse. It's just something that's personal to you. A good example is the arrows on the street. Would you really want everybody seeing your arrows on the street as part of the metaverse? Would you want them to be able to know where you're going? Probably not. That would be a little too enabling for stalkers. And if you're having a holographic conversation, the people in the room might hear you, but do you want them to hear the person at the other end of the call? Maybe, but more often we don't. You remember those, some of you are old enough to remember those Nextel phones. People would walk around in the supermarket with the volume on blast, having these conversations and you could hear both sides of it. It was incredibly annoying. So let's not do that. So an example of something super personal AR would be an ad block. Imagine ad block for AR. What does it replace the ad with? I would say your personal photos. Go to your photo collection of your family, show you your own personal photos out in the world. That's a much better, more comfortable view of the world than having to see ads everywhere. So I'd argue you really don't want your most personal data being addressable in the metaverse. There's plenty of other stuff we do want in the metaverse, but not your personal stuff. And that's even including we have good encryption and permissions, because I think you're all aware that those things are never perfect. Encryption can be cracked even over time. Permissions could be hacked. You could lose access to things. So there's some things you really just don't want to connect. AI is all in the rage in the last 3 or 4 months. Certainly it's the hype of this year. But let's talk about that for a second, because it really does relate to AR more than any other aspect of XR, I think. Notwithstanding generative AI making world stuff, holodeck stuff that we all want. But this is just a real quick digression, and just imagine this for a second. If you wanted to make a car with 2 steering wheels, you'd have a hard time doing so, because if people chose to steer in opposite directions, the car would probably crash. But I've always been super interested in this idea of implicitly having multiple controllers in the same vehicle. And so it did work out well. We made the virtual Jungle Cruise ride at Disney. In the 90s, we were able to give four people each an oar, so they could all steer the raft together, and it would sum up the physical forces. And that made for a pretty good ride, I think, as long as the current wasn't too strong. But if you don't do that right, you wind up with design by committee. So what's going on with a lot of the generative AI is that our information is being scraped. Yet another reason to not have everything always connected in a way that it can be used without our permission or compensation. But in the generative models, they're taking all this stuff and based on a prompt, making a new combination. I think the way that I like to think about that is actually it's a mashup of everybody's work. So what the output of the generative AI is very human. It's actually not artificial. It is just a clever combination of what a lot of the inputs were. And so the generative AI is really solving a hard problem for us, which is how do you make 1 million people work together when normally they would conflict in trying to agree on styles and painting. It would be very hard to make them collaborate. So the AI has a lot of value there. Another reason I think AR is special and is bigger in a sense than the metaverse is, and this one's a little tricky, but bear with me a second. So not the volume of content necessarily. The metaverse will have everything in it that's not everything that's addressable, everything that's connected. But when you think of AR as maybe being the interface to the world, it's our personal interface to whatever reality we're in, then in a sense it's bigger because it's more ubiquitous. We might use the exact same UI metaphors in the real world and to navigate virtual worlds because they become comfortable and common. So whatever metaphors we use, whether it's lines on the ground or drop pins or video inserts, whatever we choose those metaphors to be, I think we're going to want to share most of those with some exceptions. You might want to, if you want to be in, caveman virtual world, you might have a club, and that might be your interface. But in general, I think it's fair to say that, if the metaverse is basically the analogy to the internet, and hardware and software is basically our browser for that data, then the AR and AI UX might be that common interface. So in that sense, I'd say AR is bigger because it's more personal and it's more ubiquitous. So here's another question: Is there something beyond the meta? Is the metaverse the ultimate thing that we're trying to get to? And I think my answer is probably no, because I'll give you an example of some places that actually do go beyond what we were talking about with the metaverse so far. One, just in general, is understanding reality. That's where John Hanke was coming in with the real world metaverse. It's not about escaping reality, it's about connecting with reality more. But I think with in another direction, we can go inside ourselves and explore our inner worlds as well. That's a lot less spatial, but just as important. And this, sorry about the title there, I got two overlaps. But if you think about Plato's cave, that's really what's going on here is we're all looking at the shadows on the wall. What we really want to do to become enlightened is to be able to turn away from that and eventually ascend to sunlight. That means understanding the shadows on the wall well enough that we can also get out of them and get past that. And as an attempt to try to understand this, I came up with this a couple of years ago. I was inspired by the vehicle autonomy having level 0 through 5 autonomy to try to deal with some of the crazy claims around self-driving. Let's make it a little more concrete. So I decided to take the same exercise for AR and VR. First, just a couple of throwaway definitions. One is I like to use this term that Matt Meisnick coined with the adverse to describe where we are today, which is advertising funded, which we actually pay for, by the way. Never forget that money that goes to Meta and Google is actually coming out of our pockets when we buy things. But it allows the advertisers to essentially seem like they're paying for everything, so it seems free to us. The Dejaverse is a term I like for just sort of recycling the worlds. This time it'll be different, but is there really much difference between Horizon World and Second Life? Fundamentally, they're the same. It's the same idea, done a little bit differently. And what we have to worry about is the Metaverse as opposed to the Metaverse, which is where the world becomes coin-op, and everything we do gives up our privacy or time or money. And just as a throwaway joke, I came up with the verb form. To metaverse is any act of punditry which you take any cool idea from the last 30 years and call it the metaverse, which I think is maybe that joke's getting a little bit old now, but it is still true that the metaverse was a bit greedy in terms of all the things it gobbled up. So we're here in the adverse and the Dejaverse. What I'm calling the metaverse is really right around the middle of this graph, and I'd like to push the target out a little bit if we can. And let's talk about those extra new terms that I'm throwing in there. And I mean, nothing may be verse. We may not use the word verse at all in 5 years, but just going with that theme, what are these other verses that we might be interested in? So I made this giant eye chart that I'm not going to have time to go into. The article QR code is there if you want to break it down some more and understand some of these pieces. There's some really interesting pieces like consensual reality, really interesting topic. And the long-term question of does this turn into solipsism or hive mind is really interesting. I could spend a whole hour on that alone. But what I did here is just break it into a bunch of dimensions and talk about the different levels. And the key difference between what I'm calling here the exoverse is more like, Niantic, directed outside, we go explore the real world. The asoverse would be directed within. So the examples of that today might be meditation apps or any psychology apps that help deal with depression, things that are trying to help us understand ourselves better. And what we want to get is, who knows how many levels there are. So I'm just saying level 99 is a placeholder. What we want to get to is where we've really figured out omnipresence. Can we be in multiple places at the same time and experience multiple experiences at the same time? Can we push the concept of AI and search engines all the way to omniscience, where we feel like we know anything that anyone has ever learned is just within instant recall for us. And omnipotence maybe not something we gain in the real world, although we might through smart matter, all sorts of cool things people are working on. But in the virtual world, omnipotence is a lot easier. The question is, can we survive it if we have that much power over each other? That's where solipsism or the hive mind come in. And what we see with this generative AI is a move towards creatorship. We should be having more and more people be enabled to be creators, so the AI allows people to create if they don't have the skill to draw or paint or sculpt. And that's great because we want to get to a place where universal creatorship exists, and that couples in very well with this idea of omnipotence. Universal creatorship means whatever you imagine can be made real. The question we have to answer is, can we do that in a way where we don't hurt each other? That requires a sort of level of maturity that we haven't quite gotten to yet. Are there better terms? Well, I don't know. I mean, I criticize metaverse as a term, but I personally just say the whateverse because I don't really care what it's called. Just tell me what it does or doesn't do. That's much more important. We can duck type it and see what it is after the fact if you just tell me what it does. I also happen to like the term the Internet of People a little bit better because it keeps the focus on people. Just like the AI is a way of recombining the work of multiple people, the metaverse should be a way of bringing people together and connecting them. It's not about the destination, it's about the people. It's about the connections. We should focus on that because we've been talking about harassment in virtual worlds now for 30 years, and we still haven't solved it. Like that, we're not focusing on the people as much as we should be focusing on the people. We're focusing on the content too much. There's some other words you could consider if you're looking to try to solve this problem. Virtual worlds, I love that term. It's been around forever from psychology, and we've applied it to computer-mediated worlds. Presence, you all know. Co-presence, I'm sure you know, is like presence. I think those terms haven't been corrupted too much. One term I would add to that, which is like an extension of co-presence, is this idea of co-reality. So that's a potential alternate term we can use that seems a little more scientifically grounded in the literature, is less ambiguous. And in fact, I own the domains, and I'm happy to give the domains over to a nonprofit to make sure that it stays that way as something people can use if you want to use it. So there'll be no commercial development of that term. So here's my conclusion for this whole section. I have a whole nother section, which if I had extra time, we would go into, but we'll go to questions after this. So the conclusion, I think, is to sort of differentiate a little bit between XR and the metaverse. There's a lot of overlap, but there's also things that are really different. For me, the XR is primarily about people, perception, communication, and augmenting humanity. And I want to plug a really good book I hope you've all read called Augmented Human. There's the QR code there. It's one by my friend Helen Pop-Janis, and goes into this in depth about how we should be focusing on augmenting our humanity and not the world. It's augmented reality disappears the moment you turn off the power. So it's not augmenting the world, it's augmenting our perception of the world. It's also augmenting our ability to interact with the world and each other. So if you have a mnemonic to remember that, you could think of it as the API for the world, augmented perception and interaction. That's really what AR especially is about, and VR to some degree. The metaverse seems to be a lot more about the commerce, analyzing data, the network effects of a lot of people. And then there's one aspect of it to me, which is a little bit troubling, the escapist aspect of it and the transhumanist aspect. None of them against transhumanism per se, but there are a lot of people that seem to believe that the ultimate aim of the metaverse is to have an alternate reality that we can live in, and that removes the limitations of time and space and physics and biology. We can be anything we want to be. That goes to that hive mind idea. I think it's sort of missing the fact that when we turn off the power or when your body dies, then you're sort of gone. And some people might be happy, honestly, with a version of them living on, even if they know it's not them in spirit, but just a shallow copy of them. And I'm not. I would much rather figure out how to live in both worlds and move back and forth seamlessly. And I think it's more in that sense about augmenting our humanity than it is about moving on to some new form of humanism. But maybe those are the same things to some people. You can argue with me about that. XR really is dependent right now on just improving the hardware. And I can spend a long time talking about all the current deficiencies in terms of comfort, of people getting nauseated in VR. AR needs to come down, especially in power, because heat is one of the critical issues in the design of all these AR products. Until we get to better, smaller processes, we're getting down, I guess, to 3 nanometers now. The smaller, the better, because it uses less power. We can't just add battery because the key problem is removing the heat more than adding battery. And so when you're talking about, your Xbox might use 1,000 watts at certain times. Your cell phone might use 10 watts. And before it starts getting hot, your glasses, their AR glasses in the future are going to need to be down in the milliwatts, right? Maybe 1 watt maximum when it's really burning, but most of the time in the sub milliwatts. And it means everything needs to really come way down. But the things that are holding the metaverse down are regulation. We're going to need to deal with the bad actors, especially on the Web3 side. And I have a talk that I gave on fostering abundance that really gets into this idea of democracy, so I won't say much about it now. But unfortunately, anything that is pay per share, when people can own multiple shares, like in a corporation or a DAO, that ultimately results in plutocracy and not democracy, and it just makes new oligarchs. So if you're interested in that whole discussion, check out my talk about fostering abundance that I gave a year ago or so. The other key difference, I think, between XR and the metaverse, as I've discussed, is around the privacy aspect of it. And AR, I think, is this private interface to us, which is mostly about us, sometimes about things in the world. But the metaverse is really about where things come together and where things are shared and things are addressable. And I'll reiterate the privacy, I think, that's important for XR is having this firewall of our personal AI shield and our contextual discovery engines. And then when we get to the metaverse, we have all other technologies to work with that can hopefully keep our data private, like verifiable credentials and device-independent IDs. And if you watch my fostering abundance talk, you'll understand why I'm so down on blockchain, not simply for the hype issues and the fraud, but a whole bunch of other concerns about it. So I will leave it at that, and we will turn over to questions. And I think I'm going to get out of full screen so I can see you, and stop the share there. And hopefully I will be able to respond to you and let me know how you guys want to handle questions, because I obviously can't see everybody except for your names right now. So
thank you.
Hi, Abby. Thank you for the awesome presentation. So my younger brother definitely lives in the metaverse. He plays games all day and doesn't really hang out with friends outside, and doesn't even come downstairs for dinner sometimes. He just eat it in his room in front of his computer. And during the summer, I introduced him to this game called Pokemon Go, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And we went outside and we went to an actual event in person in Seattle to catch some rare Pokemons. And what I noticed there is that it's kind of like a Black Mirror episode where everyone's just in this physical space but glued to their phone. So I was just wondering, in the context of VR and AR, like what can we do as designers to kind of help alleviate this problem?
I think one positive thing about Pokemon socially is that they have these conferences and people do get to meet face to face and build social connections when they go to the conferences. But I do agree that playing the game can sometimes be social. You'll meet people when you run into them, but it can also be detrimental. They actually had to add code to make sure that people couldn't drive while playing, because they were driving into the parking lots and hitting people and hitting other cars while rushing to get to the place where a Pokemon was spawning. So they tried to address that with some technology. It is a difficult problem. So to get to the question of what designs can you do, I think any design that is going to try to get people to interact with each other in a positive way. And I guess another good thing I'll say about that game is there wasn't a scarcity of resources like you see in some games. It wasn't about, even though people did rush to get there, it wasn't so much about fighting over scarce resources. A lot of people could benefit from Pokemon showing up. And I think that was probably a conscious decision on the part of the company to make sure that many people could play the game without feeling like they were really, losing out or trampling each other like you might see on a Black Friday after Thanksgiving if you go to a physical store. I think you want to always design it to be pro-social. You want to design it so that you bring out the best in people and you reward people in the game for behavior that is pro-social, and you look for those behaviors that are anti-social and try to design those out so that they don't crop up. That is true of most game design, even games where people can be a little antisocial. If you listen to Ralph Koster talk about Star Wars Galaxies and all the work that he and others did on that, there's a ton of work that went into trying to make sure that people weren't abusing each other and harassing each other. And it's still not a solved problem, but the designers knew how important it was, because you don't want people using the game and coming away feeling burnt from it, feeling exploited, as many do, unfortunately. Next question.
Yeah, more questions from the physical audience?
I think we also want an online person.
Sure, maybe the online person can.
Vic, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. I had a question about working in sort of in the metaverse. So I work at a company called immerse.com. So I don't know if you can see my avatar, but so, we basically allow you to connect your computer into VR space and essentially tie into your voice and your audio and your facial tracking features, but I was curious to hear your perspective on what's it like to spend time working and doing productive work in the metaverse versus just experiencing things.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say I have personally never been able to use a VR headset more than an hour. So it's very hard for me to be someone who has had a productive time in the metaverse, because even if you're working on AR, you might use VR to prototype the AR if you don't have a device yet. And so I've been personally limited by that, but I've been encouraged and bolstered by some of the cutting edge technologies in eye tracking, spatial audio. When you get it right, and it's not a lot of great examples yet of this working perfectly. A lot of the spatial audio algorithms that are being used by many of the contemporaries of the app that you're working on. I'm not sure what technology that yours is using, so I don't want to criticize it, but they're using fairly simple spatial audio where they might do spatial audio panning. But when you really hear what you might call, ray traced audio, right? Really high quality audio that's as just like being there. It is profound how important that is. One of the examples of something that you wouldn't even necessarily pay attention to is the sound of your own voice changes based on the room you're in. And so if you see yourself in a cathedral, you should hear yourself in a cathedral. And so hopefully within the next couple of years, we'll all know what that's like to have really amazing spatial audio. And we'll also know what it's like when our faces can be much higher quality than the cartoons that we have today. The cartoons are limiting. It's certainly better than trying to do bad photorealism. Bad photorealism gets us stuck in, a lot of people use the word uncanny valley. I use the word uncanny mountain because it's actually asymptotic. The closer you get, the harder it becomes, especially when you know the people, because it may look photorealistic, but what happens then is you start to say, are you mad at me? Because it's not getting the emotions right. It's actually photorealistic, but lying to us and getting the translation of the emotions wrong. So anyway, it's going to be asymptotic, and we know we can cross it because we talk to real people and that works. But so far, I haven't seen an example of where faces have been reconstructed that really cross that asymptote yet. But it gets better. It gets the engagement gets better. Just adding eyes to static avatars that don't have eye tracking makes people feel like they've come alive in a way that's really compelling. And give it 5 years and we'll have photorealistic avatars. I'm the most enthusiastic though about the glasses, just because we could theoretically be capturing ourselves holographically from cameras and not have to do this machine translation of all our emotions and visemes and all the things that go into making the avatars be as good as possible, but just literally capture us as 3D video. That's something that transparent glasses promise to do that the current VR headsets would have a hard time with, but it's still a hard problem. How do we capture ourselves? How do we do the light fields? How do we spatialize? Really, really challenging. And then the question I'd leave you with is, if you're stuck with a cartoon avatar today, is that good enough? It's good enough perhaps for playing games and having casual conversations, and it might be good enough for this conversation where I don't really know most of you personally. But if you were talking to your boss or your partner or significant other, cartoon avatar probably would not be good enough for that conversation. We'd want to really get to the more like holographic telepresence that I'm hoping we get to soon.
Thank you.
Maybe one quick question that I have. I loved your list of inspirational books that you enjoyed the ideas in going over decades. I don't know, I didn't see Charles Strauss in there necessarily, but I'm sure you probably read Accelerando or know some of his work. And there's one part of Accelerando where the protagonist has been wearing his augmenting glasses for years, I guess. Someone stole them. And he basically was mentally disabled at that point because he plasticized to that. And I'm wondering if that's a risk. Already, I can't spell as well because of spell correct. I mean, I rely on it. Will we start losing capability with this in the natural world?
Oh, absolutely. But there is a curious fact about the way our brains work. Our brains are lying to us all the time about our capabilities, right? We're making irrational decisions and then after the fact rationalizing them all the time already. And for anybody who's dealt with a head injury or a stroke, they may not be aware of what they've lost at the time. So you might lose a capability when your digital prosthesis goes away, but you might just have a vague sense of frustration and not remember what it was like to have it versus not have it, because our brains are sort of covering over those deficiencies all the time. And if you watch the talk on eye tracking, you'll see, I'm sure a lot of you know about this, but there are so many things in the visual domain that we lie to ourselves about, pretending to see the world that we're not. So I think we might be okay, a little more okay than maybe Strauss is imagining, just because we're going to paper over that deficiency. But for people who've lost the ability to speak after a stroke, they certainly know it. They certainly know they've lost that ability, and for them, it's super frustrating. So I think it will come in some of those ways, just maybe not quite as bad. I would include Strauss. I would include David Brand. There's a bunch of authors I didn't include. To me, one of my favorites. I think I did include one, Werner Vinci, but he's been the closest of the techno side. But Octavia Butler really, gets the prize for nailing society for me. That just, if you haven't read the Parable books, they really describe today, I think, really well, and the near future really well.
Thank you. Should we go with the one in the chat or move on to?
Yeah, we can take one more.
Yeah, there's one last question. It's in the chat.
Okay.
From.
I see it. Let's see, what potential of the metaverse in improving mental health of people. Yes, it's already happening. We're already seeing good examples of VR used for meditation. And anytime you can help people recenter themselves, it's probably a good thing for mental health. When we usually get off balance is when we get into trouble. So that's helpful. There was to plug another science fiction novel. I thought there was a good example in Ender's Game of how VR could be used, a mental link with, I think it was depicted well in the movie as well, remarkably, that this was a way that the psychologist could understand Ender's psychology and what was going on with him, but also a way that maybe he could understand it. And I think even though a lot of VR is escapist in gameplay, and then nothing wrong with escapism in gameplay, it's just not something we should do all the time, because then we lose our grip on reality. But escapism and gameplay are ways for us to go outside of our normal daily experience and learn things that we might not be able to learn in other ways. Learn skills, but learn about ourselves. So what does it mean when you are, your identity is male, but you are playing a female character in a role-playing game? What do you learn from that experience? I'm sure that it's a positive experience in general, and vice versa. And so those are examples of things that we can do in virtual worlds. I happen to think AR is going to be the bigger one for that, because it's going to essentially be this full-time therapist that can follow us around. And whether it's an AI or whether there's a gaggle of people who watch our feed in some sort of new version of Twitch that is the Twitch in the real world, that people are watching us go through our daily lives, as boring as it may be for most of us, but they're watching and giving us advice and telling us things. It's like having a whole bunch of extra consciences and voices and therapists, to whatever degree of sophistication, a team behind us. And I think that is going to make a big difference in terms of how people act and behave in the world as well, because it's always hard to see these things ourselves. Our personality is there to defend us. It's there to defend our egos, but it's also there to hide itself. So it's useful when other people can reflect things back to us, and when the devices can reflect things back to us, we can learn quite a lot about ourselves and how we interact. The downside is if all that stuff is used against us, it's incredibly exploitive. We can be controlled, we can be enslaved by our own technology if it's being used against us. And I spend a lot of my time talking about that to make sure it doesn't happen. But the positives are so positive that you don't want to ban this stuff because it's going to be really helpful. We just have to figure out how to control it.
That's a great way to conclude your talk, as it is the challenge of the hour in many ways. As these things get smarter, so true.
We're still waiting for Stefan. I have a question.
Okay, go ahead. We have time.
Closer.
Go ahead. You can take the chair.
You mentioned some really interesting point with the part of AI, where you said you think the technology is there to bring people together, which I find really interesting. I have these 2 points. One thing, I used ChatGPT as a tool to learn. So I explained ChatGPT my perspective, and I wanted to learn about something else from that perspective, and it would take me on the hand and walk me over, so to say. It was a really interesting perspective. The other thing is used Midjourney, and I typed in some keywords about you and some keywords about Stefan, and it created this really nice, it's like knowledge-based AR. So there's something like a brain looks in there, a little bit something of a HoloLand and the world and so on. So it creates this kind of interesting synthesis of of shared spaces. So I wonder what's your thoughts if you think a little bit, or if you could elaborate on that a little bit more about really like,
Yeah.
you know, bringing us together and make us understand each other.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the translation aspect is the easiest part to see. If it can help translate concepts from one person's understanding to another person's understanding, that's super helpful. But the collaboration part that I was alluding to is an example of something I've tried with people who are pretty decent science fiction writers. Back when I wanted to be a science fiction writer, write a story, but everybody takes turns and everybody writes the next sentence. It's a terrible way to collaborate, because it's designed by committee. You wind up with a hodgepodge story where everybody goes in the direction that they were imagining, and they don't really, you know, follow other people's. But if you contrast that with, if anybody's taking improv classes, you learn the thing in improv classes you learn is don't say no, don't change the story, say yes and. So you got to go with whatever the person before you did and augment it somehow and run with it. That is what makes improv work, in that you're building on each other's ideas instead of contradicting them. And what this AI is giving us is a way to build on each other's ideas. It's taking all the different ideas and trying to fit them together in a way that matches its patterns, matches the inputs that it's seen, so that it's plausible. It may not always be right, but plausible. And so it's a hint as to one of the ways that we can collaborate. Can computers try to take the best of what each of us are saying and combine them in an augmentative way, and identify the things that are in conflict and then resolve those conflicts, pull out the conflicts that would make something cacophonous, right? And so what makes for good artwork in general is the lack of cacophony, right? The synergy of the parts to make a whole image. Some artwork can be totally cacophonous, and that's the point. But in general, it's the synergies that are working, that are meshing well, and that's what I think the AI is doing well today. The part that's missing that I have to, you know, I'm obliged to point out is that the creators aren't getting any credit. The humans who are inputting their work involuntarily, I think, need to get credit and maybe even some money if money is being made on the result. That becomes a new economy. That becomes a new world that we can live in, where we might all be encouraged to put our art and our thoughts out there for free, more so than we do today, if we knew that it was going to be protected and that someone wasn't just going to take it and make something and make money, and we wind up out of a job. So that's the part we have to figure out right now, is how to support the humans in this endeavor. But the tech is moving faster.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much, Robbie. Hope to have you at MIT in person sometimes.
Yeah.
I would love to.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.